Welcome everyone to this afternoon's plenary session, Supporting Immigrant and Indigenous Relations in Canada, Addressing Long-Standing Issues and Moving Toward a Shared Future. My name is Nancy Clark, and I'm at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. I would like to acknowledge and respect the Algonquin peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, as well as the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and the Wassanish people whose historical relationship with the land continues today. This session is sponsored by the Future Skills Centre for Research and Collaboration, dedicated to preparing Canadians for employment success. Future Skills partners with employers and industry leaders across Canada on projects that advance institutional and systemic change. We have about an hour with our distinguished presenters today. Each will have 15 minutes to present, and that will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A. Please remember to submit questions via the right-hand column on the feed loop. With that, I would like to introduce the first presenter, Oliver Camus. He is the Manager of Settlement Services in Edmonton Immigrant Service Association. Oliver moved to Canada to pursue graduate studies in education at the University of Victoria. And after graduate school, he worked at the Centre for Race, Culture, developing programs on anti-racist education, diversity, and inclusion. With that, welcome, Oliver. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for taking their time to come and attend this panel. I hope you find our collective conversation helpful. And before I begin my session, I want to acknowledge the unceded traditional land where this session is being presented from. I acknowledge that we are located on unceded territory 6 territory, a traditional meeting place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Niha, Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Satu, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose history, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. I'll be talking about a collaborative initiative between Creating Hope Society, an Indigenous organization, and Edmonton Immigrant Services Association, a settlement agency. As implied in the preamble of my presentation, the ultimate goal of this project was to increase intercultural understanding between Indigenous and newcomer youth. This project occurred between June 2018 and March 2019. We had 40 Indigenous and newcomer youth from 2 junior high schools or middle schools. And at the end of this initiative of the 9 months, a resource was developed entitled Journey to Becoming an Ally, a toolkit for Indigenous and newcomer youth. And I'll be talking later about that particular tool. Who are these two agencies that were involved in this collaboration? So I will start with ISA. ISA is a not-for-profit charitable organization incorporated in 1976 to assist new immigrants, refugees, and first-generation Canadians with their settlement, adaptation, and integration needs. The agency delivers numerous programs such as settlement workers in schools or suites, library settlement services, language bank, which is interpretation and translation, supporting newcomer integration, new neighbors, English as additional languages, to name a few. The agency's role was the fiscal agent of the project and was charged with the responsibility of identifying Indigenous partners and liaising with Edmonton school districts to identify interested schools in the project. The staff from SWIS, or the settlement workers in the school program, were involved in securing meeting venues, planning, and delivering program activities related to the newcomer youth programming in the 2 schools. Now, about Creating Hope Society. Creating Hope Society is a not-for-profit organization established to recognize that the 60s and 70s child welfare scoop of Aboriginal children is a continuation of the residential schools era. Creating Hope believes that it's time to halt the cycle of Aboriginal children being separated from their families and communities. Key programs offered by the agency include Aboriginal mothers, Aboriginal fathers, youth mentorship, youth, elder, parent cultural program, and peer-to-peer support group. The agency's role in the project included providing facilitators, running Indigenous youth programming in the two schools, and securing elders for the session. At this point, I would like to say I'm very privileged to have been asked to present this session on behalf of Creating Hope Society. Now, what happened when the two organizations met? So in this initiative, we had the meeting of two cultures. The initiative, as we said before, involved two junior high schools, namely Westron from Edmonton Public School District and H.A. Bureau Junior High from Edmonton Catholic. We wanted to have a balance. Prior to this project, each of the two schools had either an active Indigenous youth program running or a newcomer youth programming going on. But due to the collaboration between ISA and Creating Hope, the two schools were able to run two programs simultaneously. And what was exciting about this project was the programs were delivered separately each week, but participants were able to meet on bi-monthly basis to learn about each other's culture. I won't go into the details, but those were a lot of meetings in a 9 months period. What activities did this initiative cover? There were 7 major activities that were undertaken in this project. And in a summary, these activities had either a theoretical foundational basis, as well as a practical experience or component. So the first activity was Introduction to Sharing or Learning Circles. The next one was Indigenous Peoples' History, Culture, and Teachings. We also had Debunking Myths and Misconceptions around Indigenous and newcomer communities. There was another activity of Modified Blanket Exercise. The role of reconciliation in healing society was another significant activity of this project. And again, as I hinted at the beginning, there was a project resource, a toolkit to help the youth in advancing the championship of being allied to each other. So I will go very quickly regarding what happens as far as these 7 activities were concerned. The learnings from the sharing and learning circles, what happened? What did the youth take away from there? The first thing the youth learned was that the sharing circle is used to create a respectful and inclusive space for all. It's used as a method of initiating conversation and sharing groups. And I'm emphasizing present, not the past. During these sharing circles, smudging was introduced into the learning circle, and youth understood the significance of this particular ceremony. And what was interesting about how they participated was they were given the option to opt out. Most of them opted to remain and participate in this smudging as well as in the sharing circles. Another area of focus was the key sacred teachings and the traditional treatise of Indigenous peoples of Canada. Again, during this time when the two youth groups were coming together, one, the youth learned about the broad groups of Indigenous people, that the term Indigenous people was a collective one that referred to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Also important was the 7 sacred teachings, and those of you who've had a chance to familiarize themselves with the 7 teachings, they will know they refer to truth, courage, humility, love, respect, honesty, and wisdom. And I'm not doing justice here because I'm going so fast as that can be as presentation by itself. And lastly, when it came to the numbered treaties, again, the youth learned about the 11 treaties, but more significant is they learned where they were. That is, in Edmonton is located in Treaty 6 territory. One minor point about that, the photos that you see or the posters, those posters were put in the classrooms so that they could be visual reminders, identity markers, and stamps of the Indigenous culture identity in the classroom. Another activity had to do with debunking myths and misconceptions around Indigenous and newcomer activities. This activity sought to help provide accurate information and context about the experiences, culture, and values of the two communities. During these activities, Indigenous youth and newcomer youth shared how their communities got stereotyped, and they were very frank and candid about the terminologies that were thrown their ways. They identified the media, and particularly social media, as one of the precipitators of this kind of stereotypification. So they also identified incidences of bullying, harassment, and even violence, and related them with these consequences of stereotypical attitudes and behavior. Another activity that was conducted in this initiative was a modified blanket exercise. We all know that the blanket exercise takes a longer time. So for this particular purpose, this activity took 80 minutes. And what I want to emphasize was it became a great participatory tool for teaching the history, colonization, and displacement of the Indigenous peoples. Afterwards, both groups compared similar injustices experienced by their communities, such as colonialism, displacement, and bullying. Let's remember these were grades 7, 8, and 9. And at the end of this exercise, they had their own reflections. And this is what they came up with. Number one, hospitality of the Indigenous people was abused by the settlers. 2, the settlers broke the contract and deviated from the treaties. 3, the resistance that followed by Indigenous groups led to loss of culture, identity, and even lives. 4, for the groups to live peaceably, reconciliation was a must, though they acknowledge that it may take a long time. And lastly, in a very innocent way, the youth said all people should work together. The role of reconciliation in healing society. The youth were also introduced to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but we wanted to make sure that they were familiar with the basic concepts. So concepts such as truth, which had been taught earlier as one of the 7 sacred teachings of the Indigenous people, was highlighted, reconciliation, residential schools, and allies. So these terminologies were explained to the two groups. Also, the two groups also watched a video from Reconciliation Canada as a further introduction to the concept. The video discussion afterwards helped the youth explore the importance of truth-telling in dealing with painful experiences. And this is a reality that we know even currently. Truth-telling or telling the truth in our political arena is becoming very, very scarce and limited when it comes to matters pertaining to Indigenous relations. The next slide has to do with the youth resource. One of the things we thought was it wasn't enough just talking to the youth, having them participate in some experiential activities, but it was important to leave them with a resource, sort of a GPS that would help them in terms of enhancing intercultural understanding between both newcomers and Indigenous peers. So this resource, what you're seeing right in front of you, is just the front and the back cover. And the resource in itself highlights practical approaches and actions that can be mobilized whether one is working in schools, with youth groups or social groups. This resource was also meant to help both groups develop friendships and create a social action project in the school. In terms of the content, and I'm sorry, I'm not sharing that for now, the toolkit covers definitions of who an ally is, what discrimination is, the meaning of indigenous and classification, as well as who the newcomers are. It describes 3 simple steps of how a youth can become an ally. So those 3 steps are simply, number 1, I'm going to share with you what those steps are. Number 1 is to get to know one another, or understand one, to get to know one another. Number 2, after talking and listening to one another, the youth are guided in terms of taking the next step, which is to organize and educate. Once they have achieved that step, they now move on to the 3rd step, which is time to act or action. And this is the step where they put their ally identity into action. Now, it's easy for us to prescribe this, but in this resource, it was important to provide an avenue of how they would provide this. So there, in the resource, we have appendices. And so for step number 1, there's appendix number 1 that explains exactly how they get to know each other and understand each other. There is appendix number 2 that explains how to organize and educate in the school setting or even in the community setting. And number 3, how to take actions. In this way, we believe that when the youth come together, we need to provide a concrete step that would be easy for them to make the next step forward. As I add, I would like to make a daring claim that that the project was a success and it was intentionally grounded. It was grounded from a place of intentional practice. Our Indigenous facilitators from Creating Hope Society created a valuable experience for all the youth who were involved. And bringing the 2 groups together was a constructive way to begin having an open intercultural dialogue. As I add, I would say this: these 2 demographics play a big implications in terms of how we proceed together as treated people. This topic is too important to just focus on adults. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. That was an amazing presentation and very, very informative given our conversations this morning on systemic racism and how you were able to make place and space for intercultural learning with Indigenous communities as well as newcomer settlers. And what was really striking about your presentation was the common similarities of injustice, but also the tools that you're able to provide youth. And I think that's a very, very important starting place to start dismantling these processes of exclusion and starting with our educational system. So this was extremely informative, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions around how that you created intercultural understanding and a spot for truth and reconciliation. So thank you. I would like to now also, with that, thanks, introduce Katie Crocker, who is the CEO with the Affiliation of Multicultural Societies and Services of BC. And she also is in British Columbia. And her work has strengthened over 80 members and agencies and hundreds of stakeholders that work with immigrant and newcomers. Katie has expertise in children and family and women's issues, and she'll be presenting first. And then also we will have Norm Leach, who's the executive director of the Vancouver Aboriginal Community Policing Centre. And he has trained and facilitated with the Canadian Human Rights Foundation and Restorative Justice Associations in Lillooet, BC. So thank you very much for your presentation today.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks, Nancy. And what a treat to be able to follow Oliver's presentation. Thank you so much for having us here to speak with you today. As the CEO of the Provincial Umbrella Association in British Columbia, I'm in a really unique position. I get to engage in dialogue with our members, with funders, and with Indigenous leaders and elders so that we can support the sector in understanding our responsibilities as settlers on unceded and occupied land. It's a bit of a different approach when you're the umbrella. Our clients are our members and our members are service providers. And so we have that very unique opportunity to work with the folks who are developing the programming and doing the work on the ground. So I begin my presentation today with an acknowledgement that I am on the unceded and stolen lands of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And I like to express my gratitude for being here today. And so with that, I am honored to introduce you to Norm Leach. And Norm and I are going to go back and forth. We're sharing the 15 minutes. I'm going to give him the bulk of it. But I'm going to introduce you to Norm Leach now so that Norm can do a traditional land acknowledgement for you and explain that process. Over to you, Norm.
Thank you, Katie. I'm honored to present with Katie. We've really got to know each other the past year and a half. So I begin by acknowledging the land itself. The land, acknowledge it first because it was here first. The land has been here since before the beginning and has provided us everything. It's actually not property. The land is our ancestor. She's actually our greatest grandmother. And she has provided us everything since before we were humans. She's the ancestor we share with the dinosaurs, in fact. And she's provided every food, drink, shelter, medicine that humans have ever used or needed in our time here on this planet. And she's done so without question, without limit, without condition, without interruption since before the beginning. And that's how we know that she loves us, because that unconditional giving forever is essentially the definition of love. And so that's the relationship that Indigenous people have with the land. And we know that we can never fully repay her, even begin to repay her for all that she's provided us. So that's the relationship that we have with land. It is not property. And then I continue to thank the people who've taken care of these lands. And for here in so-called Vancouver, it's been the Musqueam and the Squamish and the Tsleil-Waututh people. And they've done such a good job taking care of these lands for 15,000 years, 10,000 years before the pyramids were begun. But these lands were better than new when the explorers arrived. The salmon runs were larger, the forests were more gigantic, and the buffalo herds were beyond belief. Because Indigenous people understood that it was their responsibility to their first grandmother to leave these lands as good as or better than they were originally provided. So I give thanks for the work of those people who've taken care of these lands so that we could sit here together in a virtual circle to use our many gifts as humans, and especially our best good judgment, to help each other and the people and the land in as good a way as possible on my relations. Katie?
Thank you. Thank you, Norm. So AMSA has been meaningfully engaged in this journey of listening and learning for about 3 years. For many years before that, we were doing work in this area. We were working with the City of Vancouver and other organizations. But really in the last 3 years is when we very meaningfully began to engage in this journey. And so very early on, we took the step of acknowledging that we didn't know what we didn't know. There was a lot of learning that needed to be done. And so we're kind of wrestling with this concept of how do we reconcile? How do we, reconcile to come back to a place of good and understanding when we're still enforcing systems of colonization? How is an apology and a reconciliation even possible in this time? And so we really needed that opportunity to come together and to listen. And so You can see in the slides here, the listening symposium in the center in April of 2019 was just that. We gathered in a room for 3 hours and sat in circle, literally in circle, and had all the mics of all the participants turned off, except for the Indigenous leaders and elders who sat in the center of the circle. And they shared with us for 2.5 hours, and we listened and we learned, and we started to learn about what it is that we don't know. And so the next step from that was the development of the disruption booklet. And the disruption booklet was developed by actually three individuals, two phenomenal Indigenous advocates and activists who really led us down this journey of what are the questions that we need to ask, and supported by a very engaged person of settler identity who was able to make it a very reflective experience for us. And from there, we presented the lecture series in November. Norm came and presented a lecture series for us in November of 2020, where we talked about what Norm just shared about the history and the land and the relationship to the land, and really trying to help folks understand how this comes back to the land. And so from there, we moved into our dialogue circles, and we just completed our dialogue circles this summer. And those were a very unique opportunity. It was funded through the provincial government, through the Ministry of Municipal Affairs, to bring service providers together in the different regions of BC and give them an opportunity to sit in circle with Norm and ask the tough questions and really feel safe and comfortable having the conversations about their own settler identity and their roles and responsibilities on unceded and stolen lands. So it was quite a remarkable journey that we've been on, and we're really excited to keep going. And so our next project, Norm and I are starting the plans already, but we're going to bring some Indigenous leaders into circle, and we're going to continue the discussions. So out of the dialogue circles, we had 4 key themes emerge, and so we're taking those themes to the Indigenous Leaders Circle to really reflect on them so that we can start to build more knowledge and understanding. Norm and I are hoping to form an Indigenous Settlement Organization Coalition, basically doing what you've done, Oliver, bringing together Indigenous organizations and immigrant serving organizations so that we're in the same space and listening and learning more from each other. And looking at that in an organizational learning perspective, but also in a programmatic learning perspective. We've learned that settlement service organizations really do want support in decolonizing their organizations. And so what does that look like? What are the practical implications for moving from indigenizing your organization to decolonizing your organization? And so, Norm, we've been on this journey together now for about 1.5 years. I don't see it ending anytime soon, I hope. And so I'm hoping to pass the rest of our 15 minutes over to you so that you can share your reflections on working with immigrant and settlement serving organizations and why you think that this is a very valuable place to invest your time and your energy. And in the meantime, I'm just going to go to the last slide with the resources so that if anybody would like to open up those resources or take a screenshot of the slide, then they have links to those resources. But Norm, I'm going to pass it over to you for your reflections.
Thank you, Katie. It's been very rewarding over this past week. I think we've really made the most of COVID time and able to have Zoom meetings and speak to actually a wider range and wider diversity of people online at the same time. So my work is in urban Indigenous community in Vancouver, downtown East Side, which is world famous for the conditions there. And we've learned that the roots of the conditions are in trauma and intergenerational trauma. And so we have training in an Indigenous approach to trauma and the healing that is necessary to heal the generations of trauma from colonization, residential school, but that was just one part of colonization. So in learning that and understanding that the healing path involves our connection to land, And it's not just connection to land, it's connection to everything. It's connection to everyone. And that's so powerful and so healing for us. And then we also realize that it works for everybody because we're not the only ones in the downtown east side of Vancouver. And then we started to have the conversation with settler organizations. And we started to understand that they also have intergenerational trauma. If everybody goes back in their family line and their family history, there is war, there is pandemic, there is colonization, very likely. There is injustice. And it's not just us who have suffered intergenerational trauma. So if we have found ways of healing that, then we can share those with others on how they also can heal. And it requires a common understanding of the effects of colonization. And the more I talk about it with people, the more they recognize that their ancestors too had to survive all those similarities, those common injustices, just as Oliver spoke about. So we've been able to create a safe enough space for people, large groups of people, to come together and have these conversations in a safe way, because these are difficult conversations. So we've sort of drawn on some of the teachings of Dr. Brene Brown on how to make it safe for people to re-examine their underlying core values and principles, the assumptions and presumptions that our society is built on, and start to question them a little bit and say, is that really right? Is that fair? Is it just? Because not only are our societies and our systems based upon those foundation principles, our careers, our livelihoods, our beliefs are based on those as well. So it's a difficult conversation, but we've been able to initiate it in a safe enough way that people do. And we get to some amazing places with some of these conversations. So we've been very fortunate and grateful that we've had the results that we've had, and that people want more, because people are, well, unfortunately, COVID revealed the cracks and the shortcomings and the gaps in all these systems. You know, in prosperous times, there's always enough to go around, but when times get tough is when people start to say, this system was not really built for protecting, you know, the poor, the recently immigrated, the Indigenous, the differently abled. And that's when we start to realize that we need to build coalitions. And so the settler and immigrant community is a natural ally community for the Indigenous community, because we share the harms of colonization as well. So, you know, I enjoy spending time with Katie and the AMSA groups, and it's led to other relationship and partnerships with other immigrant and refugee and settler serving agencies as well. So, but unfortunately, I think one of the major outcomes is that we have learned that the worldview of it, the Indigenous worldview and the colonized worldview, there may not be reconcilable. They're so different. But ours has a 15,000-year track record of success, and the colonized system has a 500-year track record of, well, not that good. So we've sort of come to that place, but you know, but we have good relations to at least explore solutions together. So I'm grateful for that. Thanks, Katie.
Thank you, Norm, and thank you, Nancy, for giving us the opportunity to present together today.
Thank you, Norm, and thank you, Katie. I just was reflecting on this, on your presentation, and you mentioned the commonalities related to Oliver's work as well. And I wanted to also thank Norm for bringing us back to the notion of what you said, that the land is our ancestor, which is very powerful given our current crisis in the pandemic, but also our current climate crisis. So we have a lot to learn from the Indigenous teachings. And I found it very interesting that we have a shared responsibility to listen and learn from a place of cultural humility. And so you mentioned that in order to move from indigenizing to decolonizing, that it is coming together to listen and to make place and space for listening at the community service level as well as the educational system level. And it is a place, a way of healing, as you were saying, Norm, healing from trauma and a way of moving forward. And that, again, we can learn from the teachings of our grandmother. And so we look to those teachings for sharing and learning and to listen with humility. And I think that that will go nicely with our next presenter, which is Jess Ham, on creating safe spaces for intercultural understanding of newcomers and Indigenous peoples in Canada. And so with that, I'm sure we'll have a lot of dialogue. And I'd like to also introduce our next presenter, Jess. She's the executive director with Saskatchewan Intercultural Association. And she's been coordinating and managing several programs since 2015. And over the last decade, she's served on a multitude of committees, again, with our passion for equity, inclusion, and social justice and community. So thank you again to our previous presenters. And Jess, please go ahead.
Thank you, Nancy. Tansei, everyone. My name is Jess Ham, and I'm the Executive Director at the Saskatchewan Intercultural Association. I would say it's lovely to be here with all of you today, but as we've become accustomed to these days, presenters rarely get to see their audiences. So although I can't see you, I'm glad you made the choice to be a part of the session today. I'm joining you from Treaty 6 territory, the traditional homelands of the First Nations and Métis people. And I pay my respects to the specific peoples and ancestors of these lands, which include the Naheawak, Nakawe, Dakota, Lakota, Dene, and the Métis people. I express my gratitude to be here, and I make this land acknowledgement as one of the many things that I do to work towards not just reconciliation, but towards reconciliation. I was approached to participate in this session so I could share some of the ways SIA is building safe spaces for intercultural understanding between newcomers and Indigenous people. In order to do this, I'd first like to give you a little context into who we are at the Saskatchewan Intercultural Association. Some core pieces of our organization are our vision, which is that we aspire to build an equitable community that accepts and celebrates all cultures. Our mission is to promote intercultural understanding and the retention of cultural identity and language to fully include newcomers and Indigenous people in Canadian society. And our values consist of respect, compassion, trust, inclusion, and kinship. We are a social impact organization that was founded in 1964. And since our beginning, SIA has been committed to supporting cultural groups retain their distinctive cultural identity, their language and arts, while also integrating and feeling accepted into the community. We provide programs and services that empower and relieve barriers for newcomers and Indigenous people in the areas of securing employment, language advancement, and cultural understanding. An integral part of us, it has always been to provide anti-racist education and promote intercultural understanding to the general public. We do this through workshops, programs, and community events. Our overall goal is for everyone in the community to have an equitable place. We are made up of over 70 employees from all over the world who passionately care about helping others and bringing valuable and rich diversity to our workplace. As an organization, we've gone through the process of becoming a certified Great Place to Work twice for the last 2 years, and one of those was during the pandemic. This certification is about being open to having all of your employees rate their workplace on a trust index, which includes credibility, respect, fairness, pride, camaraderie, performance, and managerial index. If you've not heard of this before, I truly encourage you to look into it. We scored over 90% overall perception on the trust index for both certifications. The process gave us an opportunity to hear where our strengths were, where we could improve on, right from our own staff. Now you may be wondering why I'm bringing this up for this talk, and no, it's not just to brag, I promise. I share this with you because we found that in order to provide services and programs that create safe spaces for your clients or for your customers, you must first create and know you have created that space for your own staff. Doing intercultural work, such as relationship building between different cultures, is not always easy. And at SIA, we are in the business of not only working with clients in our programs, but also encouraging other workplaces to be deliberate in creating their own positive work cultures for their diverse employees. Creating safe spaces is about building trust, and this is time-consuming and requires empathy, patience, and respect for all perspectives in your workplace. It also requires having diverse perspectives at your leadership tables. When you are expecting your own staff to be relationship builders and creating cross-cultural understanding, they need to feel safe first to do that work. At our agency, we take a client-centered approach, and this includes being responsive to need, inclusive, accessible, outcome-focused, innovative and flexible, and overall impact-driven. We do our work in 4 programming areas: intercultural education, youth, language, employment, and of course, we support this work with having 4 administrative departments: our HR, our communications, marketing, reception, and finance. So the first initiative that I really would like to focus on for this presentation is called our Learning Interculturalism Through Employment program. This program is a unique program that brings together Indigenous and newcomer youth between the ages of 18 and 30. We started offering this program in 2013, as we were hearing quite a bit of misunderstandings being shared between the 2 groups of clients. The intention of this program was to bring Indigenous and newcomer clients together into the same classroom with a common goal of building their confidence and skills to find work, but to also add a key component was to provide intercultural education that was designed to raise awareness, bring down any cultural assumptions and misconceptions that may exist. We provide 8 weeks of full-time classroom training, followed by a 12-week work placement. We offer 3 intakes per year with 10 to 12 clients in each class, with half of them being Indigenous and half newcomers. We have 3 employees running the program: an employment coordinator, a work placement coordinator, and an intercultural and anti-racism education coordinator. In order to support our clients succeed and give them the lift they're looking for, we provide a paid allowance while they are in the classroom portion learning together. And then we pay a reimbursement to the employers who pay them full wages when they're in their work placements. We also cover bus transportation costs, and we provide a reimbursement for a portion of any clients who need daycare covered. The classroom portion covers many sessions that help the participants develop their employability and essential skills. But for the purposes of this presentation, I want to focus on the intercultural portion. These sessions can include cultural sharing and cross-cultural communication, anti-racism education, anti-oppressive education, Canadian and Indigenous history, Indigenous culture and knowledge systems, including elder visits, land-based education, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Section 15, gender and sexual diversity, and mental health and addictions. These are the topics that create a safe space to learn, ask questions, and where the clients gain the educational tools and resources that build positive relations between Indigenous and newcomer youth. It is through these sessions that the youth are together, introduced to the idea of cross-cultural sharing, and participate in icebreakers that set the stage for their intercultural learning and sharing to come. They have the opportunity to share about their own culture and build an understanding of the depths and intricacies of other cultures. They practice strategies for effective cross-cultural communication and learn about anti-racism education. They learn various historical effects on culture, and in addition, the role that the media plays in developing stereotypes and misunderstandings about culture in Canada. They're able to identify oppressive ideologies, stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, and be able to share their personal experiences. They learn historical information about Indigenous peoples and learn about treaties, residential schools, and participate in Indigenous cultural activities. And lastly, they develop an understanding for cultural difference and how developing their intercultural understanding will prevent them from experiencing these issues in the workplace and in other areas of their lives. Some things I had to share after providing this program for the last eight years. In order to create truly meaningful relationships between different cultural groups, there needs to be time to develop trust and common ground. Be careful of your assumptions. We cannot always know how someone will react or feel about a topic, or what might be triggering content to some but not to others. Some people also may not be as connected to their culture as you would assume, and will be uncomfortable or resistant sharing their stories with others. Not everyone is ready for intercultural work, but we have seen strong resistance fade quite quickly when they've had the chance to develop friendships with people from other cultures. Because of the impacts of the residential schools and the intergenerational trauma experienced by Indigenous people, it's very important to include elders and knowledge keepers throughout your programming. Due to what I just mentioned for Indigenous clients, but also for newcomers who may have experienced trauma in their homeland prior to coming to Canada, you should always have mental health supports available. Over the years, this program has seen clients change their lives and develop long-term friendships. Some get jobs, some go back to school, or some realize they need to do more work on themselves and their mental health before they're ready to take these steps. Programming like this isn't always easy to run, but it is incredibly rewarding when you see the successes. I know I don't have a lot of time, but I'd like to share a few testimonials with you from our Light clients. First one. I'm very grateful to the help as it assisted me to stand out as a confident and composed person who now fully understands many new cultural and social values and be able to exercise newly learned interpersonal skills in pushing the way forward. During the Light program, I learned about many new ideas and ways to prepare for interviews, resume, and cover letter writing, and provided me the opportunity to closely interact with colleagues coming from various cultures and social environments. Another one. I wouldn't be where I am without Light. I'm seeing my daughter every second weekend now. I just bought a car. I bought good runners that I can wear to work because I needed them. If Light hadn't helped me by paying for the cab so I could get to the interview or connecting me to my work placement and now my job, I don't know where I'd be. And the next one, I gained confidence to express my feelings to other people. It's very helpful to release my fear regarding new culture and new country. The valuable thing I have learned in the interculturalism sessions is how to communicate with people from other cultures, how to be self-dependent in a new place because I'm new here. I needed this help and this program helped me a lot. And the last one here, I have had a successful experience because of Light, and now I am looking at a full-time job. Being a single mother of 3 beautiful babies, I am now successful in finding full-time employment thanks to the tools and the skills I gained through the Light program. I'm always so inspired and proud of the successes of the clients in this program. Often many will be up against several barriers, and all they need is just a little support, and they can take control of their futures. I also wanted to share just a few other initiatives that we're doing. One of them that we started doing was reconciliation forums. This is where we've utilized, sorry, I lost my place. We started doing reconciliation forums where we are supporting the learning and understanding between newcomers and Indigenous people. We hosted 2 of these, one in October of 2018 and the other in January of this year. The theme for these forums was bridging newcomer and Indigenous communities through offering a space to discuss Canada's treaty obligations and offering solidarity to the struggles of Indigenous people. Both events highlighted Indigenous culture performances and included panel discussions and speakers who discussed perspectives and research in relation to reconciliation. These events included Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers who shared their stories and wisdom with the attendees. Although these events were open to the general public, we invited all of our clients who were attending our programming to attend these forums and actually built it in as part of their regular programming. This provided our clients with the access to an opportunity to hear from local experts and elders and see cultural performances, and then to debrief with their instructors and coordinators at their next class, where they felt safe to ask questions or receive clarification on anything they didn't understand. And lastly, I wanted to touch on our Culture Sync and Intercultural Education programming. So SA has always been offering some form of intercultural and anti-racism education in the community, but more recently we've been able to focus on this more. Last year, our Culture Sync program started offering tea time sessions, which are community discussions on culture and history through various ethnocultural voices, perspectives, worldviews, and epistemologies. Some of these topics covered are Indigenous storytelling, Black History Month, cultural celebrations, holiday food and traditions, winter wellness, Ramadan and Eid celebrations, the legacy of residential school experiences, and what does Orange Shirt Day mean to you? These sessions were meant to be offered in person, but because of COVID, we've been offering them online. One benefit is we usually have between 50 to 200 people tune in and participate. This programming allows us to educate across all cultures and spaces while focusing on topics that are relevant and providing local presenters who provide authentic and relatable information. Also, due to the pandemic, we started offering global story boxes as a way to reach people and educate in an immersive and interactive way. Clients receive an activity kit filled with culture and history in the form of items related to education, advocacy, and support. Kits include local goods and services, arts, crafts, educational materials, and many other items that relate to the theme being covered. These kits also offer suggestions for dealing with sensitive issues and encourage clients to reflect on culture, identity, expression, and sense of belonging. Since we've not been able to bring large groups of people together, this has been an effective method of increasing intercultural understanding during the pandemic. Our intercultural programming has also created specific modules focusing on Indigenous education. These presentations review the origins of Canada, including treaties, historical and cultural narratives of Indigenous peoples, and the resurgence of traditional ways of knowing and doing. In pursuit of the call to action numbers 57 and 93 in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report, these Indigenous education modules deliver knowledge about Canada's diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples and cultures, while clarifying histories surrounding the colonization of North America. We've also tailored these sessions for our newcomer clients and work with our other programs to offer these sessions during their regularly scheduled hours, as we have found newcomers quickly develop stereotypes and believe myths about Indigenous people shortly after arriving. In our experience, sometimes you need to bring communities into the same room together to be most effective in creating intercultural understanding. But if that's not possible, there are many other ways to make connections. And sometimes it's important to educate in the space that they already are learning. Education needs to be done in a safe space that allows for authentic and relevant learning. I would like to close now by thanking you for listening and hoping you found some of what we're doing interesting. I'm happy to answer any questions during the Q&A at the end of our session. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Jess, for that wonderful presentation. And we heard the common theme of intercultural understanding and again, creating safe spaces. But your work with the LIGHT program took us to think about equity, points of diversity, and particularly fostering trust, which is at the crux of our work in order to decolonize our settlement services and our processes. So I think your work is outstanding in how you've been able to do that within an employment sector, which is one of the key determinants of integration and cultural integration in Canada. And so thank you. I think there will be lots of questions with that. Our last but not least presenter is Anthony Usola, and he's the Executive Director of Truly Alive Youth and Family Foundation. And he also serves as the chair of the Saskatoon Black Canadian Alliance Network, a working group comprising of membership drawn across Saskatoon and the Afro-Caribbean community. So I'd like to welcome Lusa as our final presenter today.
Thank you so much, and it's a great honor to be here today. I'd like to stand on all existing protocol and to also acknowledge that I am reaching out to you today from Treaty 6 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis people. We remain grateful to the First Peoples of this land, and we thank them for their continual support for all Canadians, from the first settlers to even generations yet unborn. My name is Anthony Adeboale Olushola, and I'll be speaking to us today on the theme Navigating Immigrant Indigenous Relations in Canada, a New Way Forward. My theme is drawn from the main theme of this plenary session, addressing long-standing issues relating to Indigenous and immigrants in Canada and trying to find a way forward together. I hope you'll agree with me that to love is to know, and to know is to serve. But we can only serve that which we have allowed ourselves to know. In the words of Bob Marley, if you know your history, then you will know where you're coming from. And I do recognize that most of us joining this conference are veterans at conferences. But I'd also like to recognize that there are some who are joining this conference for the first time, many of whom perhaps need to go through, refreshers course, if you will, as regards issues relating to Indigenous and immigrants in Canada. And why is it that we're talking about these two groups? What about the third group, if you will, the perpetrator kind of group? It's often in the case that we bring victims together and we expect them to build resilience. And most of our programs are often tailored toward building resilience, Indigenous newcomers building resilience. What do we do, or what are we doing when it comes to the perpetrators? That's a food for thought as I progress with my presentation. So I'd like to take us through the journey as it was in the beginning. Indigenous peoples, with all due respect, and I always say that there is no way I could ever and will ever talk about Indigenous peoples' cultures and traditions as Indigenous peoples themselves will. But coming from a colonial experience, originally from Nigeria, a country who has, I would say, has its own fair share, not had, has, in colonial experience. And if you will, as a Black man, often described as a descendant of slaves, forgetting that all Black people, I stand to make this claim, are descendants of people enslaved. So it is important that we make that distinction, that no Black person is a descendant of slaves, but people enslaved. With that being said, most cultures come from rich and unquestionable sense of identity, a deep sense of connection to their roots, selflessness, and respect. This is how it was in the beginning. And then along came a new order, cultural erosion, alien civilization, the divide and conquer strategy, leading to loss of identity and people eventually having to struggle for recognition. In effect, there's distrust amongst people. They become disoriented, us versus them syndrome, leading to community being in distress, and in essence, the system thrives. I'd like to take us into the future, even though we are in 2021. Let's take a sneak peek into the future of Canada. Studies show that Canada's future will be defined in surprisingly large measures by Indigenous people and new Canadians. You'll agree with me that Canada has the highest rate of population growth amongst the G7 nations. And this increase was overwhelmingly driven, 82% if you will, by the arrival of immigrants and non-permanent residents. So this tells you that the Indigenous peoples of Canada and the new arrivals shape and will shape the future of this country, letting us recognize that diversity is everywhere. However, inclusion remains debatable. Immigrants coming from racialized distinct minority groups feel less confident that they fully belong in Canada, even after living here for some time or for so long. Visible minorities in Canada are more likely than those in the United States to face discrimination during hiring. I hope some of us can relate. So when we talk about diversity, it's everywhere happening. We can see it. It's in our communities. But what about inclusion? Judge Floyd gave a lot of communities, groups, corporations, a reason to come out and take a knee. But I wonder how many organizations today have members of Black communities in their leadership positions. We'll continue to reflect on the ongoing realities that we are becoming to know more of regarding the unmarked graves relating to missing children. I call them missing because they're never coming home. And most of us show that we care. But I wonder how many more we're going to find by way of unmarked graves, and how many Indigenous persons or communities will be helped out of the situation that is just not human, if you will, as the system continues to make it so. And these are some of the issues, if you'll agree. Let's look into diversity and inclusion. What are the main things that happen? Regardless of how great your resume may be, sorry, we're not hiring. And even when we hire, it is often tokenism in its nature. Just so we can demonstrate for photo-ops that we have someone of certain group. Nice idea, but we're going to table that. So even when you get to that table, when we get hired, how often do our ideas get to matter? And in effect, what happens to members of visible minority, indigenous, and immigrant communities? They are forced to stay on their own. We're just going to stay on our own. Again, the system has a way of getting us to that kind of mindset and the action that follows. We just stay on our own. And then we become those people. And because the system tries not to keep us in that those people kind of corner, what then do we do? Political correctness is the order of the day. A friend of mine, an indigenous person, convocated as a lawyer, and he was having a chat with his fellow lawyers who were just having their convocation ceremony. And he posed a question to them. He says, what do you call an indigenous person who's a lawyer? And his white friends and everyone around, a few seconds was lagging because they were trying to find the politically correct response to give to him. And he says to them, you call him a lawyer, don't you? Am I any less a lawyer than you people? Why does it have to take you time to even say that such a person is a lawyer? And that's what politically correctness does. And that's the order of the day. So let's do a little bit of reality check. The divide between Indigenous and New Canadians, marked primarily by limited engagement and much less by conflict and antagonism, remains one of the most fundamental gaps in Canada's political landscape. And without an organized effort at relationship building, understanding, prejudice, and even racism is likely to exist if, of course, you agree with me, it's everywhere happening. Especially in areas where there are large and concentrated populations of both groups. The divide between Indigenous peoples and New Canadians remain one of the fundamental gaps in Canada's political landscape. How so? One, the lack of robust initiatives and opportunity for sincere, honest, and level playing dialogue by government, academics, and nonprofit organizations toward facilitating relationships building, leading to information gap, harbored resentment, and shared animosity between the two groups. So when we do not have robust conversation, honest and sincere conversation, then what we get in return is information gap. Effect of that, harbored resentment. And what do we get? Shared animosity between the two groups. So why is the system herding information? Why is that? Why are we tailoring, if you will, the strides at building dialogue through neo-colonial context and framework? Most of the work that we do, most of the programs that are being created continues to promote neo-colonial framework. We talk about Indigenous and newcomers being a relationship. In one of my previous works, I was engaging with a settler friend, otherwise now called mainstream or vocation. And I was passionate about my work and sharing how it's important that we bring a third group. We have Indigenous, we have newcomers. We need to bring the settlers to the table for robust understanding. And my friend says to me, I think you should keep it between the Indigenous and newcomers. And I says, but why? We need the settlers to be at the table. And he goes, well, it's just because I don't like to be called a settler. This fellow doesn't like to be called a settler, but feels the right to name every other group as refugee, as newcomer, as indigenous, as aboriginal, and every other name that comes along with that. But I don't blame this fellow. And when these things happen, when only token acknowledgement is given to Indigenous peoples in Canada vis-a-vis the history, residential school experience, and contributions to Canada, they are more likely to not engage. We don't fault them for that. So let's break the glass ceiling if you're really willing to do that. Ethnically diverse workforces aren't just important for social justice. It is also good for the economy. In fact, I'd like to extend that saying to the words of wisdom by Honorable Hamed Hussein, who once said, ethically diverse workforce is a smart thing to do. It's not a good thing to do, it's a smart thing to do. A 2018 study found that on average, a 1% increase in ethnocultural diversity in the workforce is associated with a 2.4 increase in revenues and a 0.5% increase in productivity. This is known as the diversity dividend. Again, a diverse workforce is not the right thing to do or good thing to do. It is a smart thing to do. Think about it. I'd also like us to keep in mind that we are all treaty people. I want to join my voice to that of Ubuntu that says there is no substitute for human connection. I am because you are. But it takes certain state of being to recognize that the statement that says I am because you are does not end there. It also suggests that you are because I am. Socrates, in one of his great sayings, says that the greatest way to live with honor in this world is to be what we pretend to be in reality what we want others to think we are. So let's stop pretending. If by my way of pretense I show that I love you, then let me love you. If I show that I care about you, if I call you my sister, my brother, my relative in your presence, then I should do the same behind your back. Then that leads to the fact that only equals can become friends, Maya Angelou. Only equals can become friends. So you first need to recognize that we're equals before you can see me as a friend or a colleague. It is in the little things, the way we treat one another, the way we recognize that we don't have all the answers, the way we keep to know that coming to a conference is not only about the scholarly articles, but recognizing that it's as human beings coming together to see what am I going to change about myself, my way of life, my conduct to one another. It is not about just the system, but humans who drive the system. It's in the little things. The strength of a nation, people, is in the health of its people. The strength of a nation is in the strength of its people. Recognizing a multicultural society is always a work in progress. It is therefore important to know that intentional care, openness to learning, and conscious effort to addressing the elephant in the room are all necessary steps towards walking the road leading to Canada's future. Intentional care, openness to learning, and conscious efforts to addressing the elephant in the room. Whatever that elephant in the room is at your end, you've got to talk about it and be comfortable to listen. Now, what is Canada's future? I leave you with two things to reflect upon. The first is that we need to reconnect with the beginning. In the beginning, people cared about each other, rich culture, selflessness, sense of identity, sense of belonging. People were living, they weren't trying to survive. So let's connect again to the beginning. And I'll say, let us humanize humans. There is no one human being that is superior to the other. None. So if what we have learned from our foreparents is that certain group is privileged than the other, well, it's wrong. So stop it already. If all you've learned is that Black people are descendants of slaves, well, get re-educated. You can get away with an understanding that they are descendants of people enslaved. If you're uncomfortable with being called a settler, then don't feel the right to keep changing other groups' names at will. Don't consider Indigenous, immigrant, and other ethnocultural groups as those who can only use service. We can provide services. We don't want to just be those people at those tables. We want to be at all tables. You may think that I'm done. It is true. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. This was your presentation was so amazing that my summary will pale in comparison, but I do want to commend you on helping us shift the gaze toward the structures of powers and to really be courageous to have those interrogating questions. And I love the way that you started, to love is to know and to know is to serve. And the questions that you have for us around disrupting the perpetuation of inequities and helping us shift the gaze. So this is just a remarkable way to perhaps start this ongoing sharing. There's been a lot of questions in our for our presentation today, and many of the questions have really been around sharing. How can we share, teach, and learn across points of difference? So I think that we are a little bit short of time, but I'll do my best. Perhaps we have time for addressing one or two questions. And one of the questions, which could really go to anyone, is, so given, Anthony, what we were just discussing and the need, shifting the gaze, what are some tips on how we can approach or to begin these conversations across not only Indigenous and newcomer groups, but as you say, those people who shall not be named? What are some ways to move forward? Anthony, you might want to start.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to start by saying that I believe so much in the principle of for and by. And that means that to want to learn is to reach out, not to wait for the Indigenous or immigrant communities to come. Learning stems from my willingness to reach out. And because the system is designed in such a way that the mainstream have all the answers, and that continues to be perpetuated down the years, that is not true. So I think to begin the conversation is to come to Indigenous, to immigrant groups, to ethnocultural communities and say, how can we learn from you? Not to say, come, let us teach you. It goes down even to programming that we offer. We don't need to create program because we think it's going to benefit the community. We should go to the community and say, how can we work together? What are your ideas? So consultative engagement to the community, and not, again, it goes back to my saying, let's not consider tables or groups as though they need service. They can be service providers only when we reach out honestly.
Thank you. And some of the questions have also revolved around how can white settlers join in some of the tools and mechanisms that some of the settlement organizations have developed. For example, intereducational opportunities and sharing circles. Maybe Katie or Norm, maybe I will direct that question your way.
Well, we don't do direct service delivery. So for us, we're leveraging our umbrella networks. So we already have the tables. We already have government at the table. We have settlement organizations at the table. We have community partners at the table. So we have the ear. And so it's, you know, it's our responsibility to use the voice we have and create the spaces that we can create. As an umbrella organization, we have a lot of opportunity to create space. And so I'm going to do that right now and create space for Norm to share his insight.
Well, one way is to ask everyone in the room, and maybe this room, who here considers themselves Indigenous? And not many people put up their hand. And I would say, well, then you have to reconsider that, because everyone is Indigenous to somewhere. Maybe not here and now, but if you go back in your family line, there is a place where your family, your ancestors lived for 1,000 years or more. And they had that relationship with that land that we have here with ours. And if you can sense back into that connection to land that your ancestors had there, then you know what we feel here. And that exists in all human ancestry. So it's a rethinking and a context for people to understand that connection to land and where it roots. So that's one way. There's more.
Thanks, Norm. There's been questions around, are there tips for some of the newcomer organizations that haven't yet approached Indigenous people, and how could they build meaningful inter-community relationships? Maybe Jess, do you have any tips for how perhaps those organizations that haven't yet reached out, how they could do that?
That's a good question. I think it definitely starts with being respectful of traditions and making sure that when you reach out, you do it by following ceremony and doing it in a good way. Like for us, having Indigenous employees at all levels helps us with that. So employing Indigenous people will make it so you can have more credibility in reaching out to Indigenous communities, and offering tobacco when you ask for any type of advice or support, making sure that you pay Indigenous people for their time. Quit asking for them to volunteer their time or their their wisdom sharing or their stories. Make sure that you build in budgets or find grants to make sure that they're compensated for those stories or those gifts that they share with your organization.
Thank you, Jess. And there was another question around, Oliver, I think this perhaps goes to the work that your agency's been doing in becoming an ally. There was a question around, is that resource specific to the Edmonton area, or would it be applicable across regions without any modification?
Yeah, thank you for that. The resource is generic. So number one, this resource targets junior high students. So it was deliberately made to such a way that anyone can employ it. So it's not restricted, anyone who is interested in it. I will make it accessible. It was funded by Canadian Heritage, so we don't own the resource, so it's up there for public consumption. So And there are other resources out there for adults. But for this one, we just wanted to see how the young ones could come together with GPS, as I kind of said, how they could continue with this journey of becoming allies.
Thanks, Oliver. And we are quite 10 minutes over time, so perhaps we could leave it there. But I just wanted to, again, thank all of our presenters. It's been an amazing learning experience about what is happening related to truth and reconciliation, how we need to shift the gaze and actually create space for meaningful engagement and trust, and hopefully build a way forward to dismantle systemic racism and provide spaces for decolonization within our own settlement and immigrant service agencies with the people of the land. So again, thank you everyone for this amazing presentation. And I wish you well, and I hope we can get together very soon.